नमस्ते, म गङ्गा छन्त्याल। म चाहिँ राष्ट्रिय आदिवासी जनजाति अपाङ्ग महिला सङ्घ निडवानमा चाहिँ विगत 2015 देखि नै म त्यसमा आबद्ध छु। अनि हाम्रो यो संस्थाले चाहिँ विशेष गरेर चाहिँ आदिवासीमा, महिलामा र अपाङ्गता भएको व्यक्तिमा चाहिँ स्पेसल काम गर्छ। त्यो भित्र पनि अझै सीमान्तकी समुदायको महिलाहरूलाई चाहिँ स्पेसल फोकस गर्छ। अनि हामीले चाहिँ निडवानले चाहिँ मेन भनेको डकुमेन्टेसन, एडभोकेसी र लबी हो। यो सँगसँगै चाहिँ विभिन्न किसिमको अवेरनेसको कार्यक्रमहरू अनि विभिन्न किसिमको क्रियाकलापहरू कार्यक्रमहरू गर्दै आइरहेको छ। जुन मानव अधिकारको कुराहरू गर्दै गर्दाखेरि चाहिँ हैन, हाम्रो आदिवासी अपाङ्गता भएको समुदायको व्यक्तिहरूले चाहिँ मानव अधिकार के हो त भन्ने कुरा नै उहाँहरूले थाहा छैन हैन। आफूलाई समस्या पर्यो भने, आफूमाथि भाइलेन्स भयो भने, हिंसा भयो भने हैन, उनीहरू कहाँ गएर बोल्ने, कहाँ गएर निवेदन दिने, कुन तरिकाले यो केसलाई अगाडि बढाउने भन्ने कुराहरू पनि थाहा छैन। जस्तै मेरै हकमा हेर्दाखेरि पनि म आदिवासी अपाङ्गता भएको महिलाहरूको नेतृत्व गरेर हिँड्दै गर्दाखेरि पनि यी कुराहरू मलाई पनि कतिपय जानकारी थिएन हैन। आज यो कार्यक्रमबाट चाहिँ मैले धेरै कुराहरू सिक्ने अवसर पाएँ।
नमस्ते, म हेमकुमारी राई हो। मेरो घर चाहिँ इलाम हो, बसाइ चाहिँ चाबेल।
के गर्नुहुन्छ त?
म चाहिँ अहिले चाहिँ मेरो पार्लर छ। म चाहिँ निडवानबाट बास्केट प्लेयर पनि हो।
खासमा यो संस्थाले के गर्छ? यसको के हो उद्देश्य? के कुन क्षेत्रलाई हेर्छ? यसले समुदायमा के गर्छ? कस्तो कस्तो मान्छेहरूलाई समेट्छ?
यो निडवानले चाहिँ आदिवासी जनजाति भएका हाम्रा महिलाहरूलाई चाहिँ पछाडि परेका वर्गहरूलाई अब कहाँ कुन कुन ठाउँमा चाहिँ कस्तो अवस्थामा छन् हो त्यसलाई चाहिँ कसरी बाहिर निकाल्ने त्यो रूपले चाहिँ अहिलेसम्म चाहिँ हेरिराख्नु भएको छ। र अहिले हामी चाहिँ आदिवासी जनजाति र पछाडि परेका व्यक्तिहरूलाई चाहिँ कसरी बाहिर निकाल्नुपर्छ र के गर्ने हो, तिनीहरूलाई चाहिँ कसरी सहभागी गराउने र कस्तो कस्तो ठाउँमा चाहिँ लाने र कसरी लाने भनेर चाहिँ यो निडवानबाट मात्रै थाहा भएर हामीहरूलाई पनि अहिले मलाई पनि अहिले जहाँसम्म यो निडवानबाट चाहिँ हरेक प्रोग्रामहरूमा अहिले हामीले चाहिँ यसरी हिँड्नु पर्दछ। अब जुनै अब हामीले गर्ने इच्छा भए तापनि हामीले चाहिँ ठाउँ नपाएर पनि अब हामीले चाहिँ थाहा नभएर पनि रहेछ। अब यो निडवानबाट चाहिँ यो प्रोग्रामहरूबाट चाहिँ जस्ट अलिअलि हामीलाई पनि थाहा हुँदै आएको छ, चाहिँ केही सिक्न बाँकी नै छ।
And so in light of that, I'm joined here today by 4 really amazing experts, 3 who are here obviously in person, and one of whom is joining us online from Pakistan. So, without further ado, what I'd like to do is to give my speakers a chance to introduce themselves, to say hello to the crowd, and just to tell all of you a bit more about who they are and the work that they are currently doing. So let's start with you, Prakash.
So hello everyone, my name is Prakash Bhattrai and I'm currently associated with an organization called Center for Social Change. It is a Kathmandu-based social think tank working on issues around labor and migration, governance and civic engagement. And I'm busy in this field over the past 20 years. Initially, I was mostly focused on doing research and advocacy on labor migration issues, but over the years, we are trying to understand the nexus between climate change and migration, particularly in the context of Nepal. So, thank you.
Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Geertra. I work for IOM, the International Organization for Migration. I'm based in Bangkok, where we have a regional office for Asia and the Pacific. And I'm the Senior Regional Specialist for Labor, Mobility and Social Inclusion. I've been with IOM and the UN more broadly for about 15 years, working in Africa, Europe, now Asia, mostly around migration issues, but also human rights issues. So lovely to meet all of you.
Thank you. Good afternoon, colleagues. My name is Dino Corel. I work with the International Labour Organization, ILO. As a labour migration specialist, I'm based in the Decent Work team for South Asia, which is based in New Delhi, India. and previously I worked also with the ILO in Nigeria and West Africa and in North America. Thank you.
Thank you for that, Dino. Tala, online, would you like to introduce yourself and tell us a little bit about your work?
Thank you. And Pitamon, just let me know if you can't hear me.
We can hear you loud and clear.
Okay, brilliant. Well, it's great to be here. Thank you so much for the invite. My name is Tala Khan. I'm the CEO of a non-profit called Pakistan Environment Trust, where we're focused on establishing platforms to mobilize finance at scale to tackle the climate crisis. We're convening the National Net Zero Coalition. We're developing the carbon market in Pakistan and focused on ecosystem restoration projects. And prior to this, I was working with McKinsey in London for many years. I was leading a lot of transformation work within the green transition for large-scale infrastructure companies as well as sovereign wealth funds.
Great, thank you. Oh, sorry.
And now, I'm just saying it's great to be here.
Oh, great. Thank you for that, Tala. So, now that you are acquainted with our speakers, let me start the discussion. Talha, actually, let me throw it over to you first. Given the extensive work that you've done in terms of understanding the impacts of climate change, would you be able to help provide us with some context in terms of what climate change means for human rights and human security in the South Asian region?
Well, and I must say it's quite a complex topic, to be honest, to capture. And so let me just frame the narrative from a Pakistan perspective. I mean, if you think about the recent floods in Pakistan, almost 33 million people were impacted through those floods. Somewhere roughly between 8 to 9 million people have been exposed to a health disease, to healthcare issues after that has impacted many livelihoods, as well as sort of the human security side of it as well. And then roughly around the same number of people have been pushed below the poverty line in the context of the recent Pakistan floods. And this is just from a recent report by World Bank. If you look at some of the McKinsey reports as well, that are looking at the impact of climate change, roughly speaking, around 50% of the global population will be impacted by one of the climate hazards, either water stress, heat stress, drought, or flood in the next decade or so. So the numbers are quite frightening when we see the impact that climate change will have on human lives. And we're seeing that happen in Pakistan right now. We're seeing that happen in many of the other regional countries as well. But what I'd love to do, just to set the context, is to look at the drivers of the drivers that lead to the impact that climate change has on human life. And I believe there are three drivers that'd be interesting to speak about and discuss in more detail in this conversation and beyond this panel discussion as well. I think one of them is the global decarbonization journey, the global net zero ambition. That I think would be important to sort of dig deep, look at the human aspect of it. I think the second aspect that'd be important to look at is the population growth, because while our existing population is going to face the impact of climate change, I think population growth will further exacerbate the impact that climate change has on lives, as well as the impact it has on different aspects of human rights as well. And I think that the third aspect to look at will be the economic side of it, or the financial capital side of it. How are the finances flowing in different directions to tackle some of the issues some of the impact that climate change has on our lives? So let me just spend a few minutes on each one of them, share my perspective, and I think some of the thoughts that I've had, and I'd love to sort of hear from the rest of the panel as well as we go through this discussion. And if they're missing any of the driver that they believe is. So if I could quickly share my screen, and I want to sort of actually, before I show you the screen, I'm going to refer to, when it comes to decarbonization, I want to refer to another McKinsey study that looked at the impact of global net zero transition on around 70 countries across the globe that contributes roughly between 90 to 95% to global GDP. And what they were looking at two aspects of it. They were saying, when the world moves towards net zero, what will happen to the economy of these countries? How exposed will these countries be to this global transition? And the second aspect they looked at is the economic strength of these countries to to actually cope with the transition. The whole global net zero transition, where we're trying to sort of bring emissions down to pre-industrial levels by 2050. And these dark circles actually show the impact that climate change have on human lives. But beyond that, it also shows that in terms of our economies, we're highly exposed to high-emitting sectors. So when it comes to decarbonizing our economies, it's going to take a lot more effort for us to move from this top left to the top right or the bottom right? I mean, on the right side of this graph. And if you look at the bottom side, you see that in terms of GDP per capita, we also have the lowest GDP per capita when it comes to those 70 countries, most of the countries in our region. So basically means that most of our countries don't even have the economic strength to tackle or meet this ambition. Now, what is the so what from this, from a human aspect? So I'll just give you one example from Pakistan. So I'm saying that is one implication of it. So decarbonization will have a huge impact on many of the livelihoods that people have in these economies. I think that's one angle of it. The second angle of it from a population growth perspective.
By climate change, and there is really no doubt that this will have an impact on migration and mobility in the region. In IOM, a study with economists where we're looking at this also has an impact because people might lose their livelihoods because of drought. And this leads to migration as what we would call an adaptation strategy. Now the issue is that here the evidence is much more difficult to collect because of course climate change wouldn't be the only driver for people to migrate. There are many other drivers, lack of employment, lack of decent work, individual aspirations even. So how do you determine that a person moves for climate change? Actually, people don't move because of climate change. They move because of the impact that climate change has on their livelihoods and on their well-being. And this is difficult to make that causal link. Now, looking at the human rights impacts of this, what we do see also through other research that we've conducted with the Stockholm Environmental Institute that has also a link between climate change and human trafficking, labor exploitation. Because what happens is that people who are affected by climate change, who lose their livelihoods, they're already in a more vulnerable situation. They might not have access to legal migration opportunities. They might see irregular migration as their only option. And this is particularly true for example, women or children. So there is evidence that this leads to increased forms of human trafficking, to forced labor, to indebtedness, which then leads to that bondage, etc. But again, here there is really need for more research to establish these links between climate change, human trafficking, other forms of exploitation more clearly. Perhaps the last element to consider is that a lot of the discussion around migration, environment, climate change is about how climate change would lead to more migration. But let's also not forget the impact that climate change and environmental degradation has on migrants who are already working abroad. Because it's for sure that, let's say, increased temperatures, increased heat waves, these affect the working conditions of migrant workers in agriculture, construction. There is evidence that more heat leads to more injuries, for example. So this is another area where I think more research is needed to explore. But I'm hoping the other candidates will also share from their research findings. Thank you.
Absolutely, thank you so much, Mithru. I think, thinking back to the graphic that Talha shared just now, mentioned that South Asia, of course, will be subject to a lot of heat, right? And you already touched on that in terms of people being driven to migrate and even going into irregular migration because they have no other options. So it's not climate change per se, it's the impact, the manifestations of climate change that are potentially driving these trends. I also appreciated how you really highlighted how climate change is that force amplifier. It's enhancing the kind of the multi-dimensional vulnerabilities that we see across different social groups. So let me turn to you, Prakash, because I understand you've been doing work in this space and you also have a lot of ground-based observations to share with us. Who do you see as being amongst the most impacted by the impacts of climate change? And do you see this whole climate change-induced migration as an emerging trend for South Asia?
Thank you. let me begin my, thoughts presenting you some of the facts based on, our research and gathered from different sources. So, according to the Ministry of Finance published report, in the first 6 months of this fiscal year, the issuance of new labor permit for foreign employment increased by 64.6% compared to the last year. Likewise, the issuing labor re-permit has been increased by 9.5%. So that means there is an increasing trend of foreign labor migration. The second fact, in Nepal, in 2022, nearly 245 disasters events were recorded, and out of that, 32,000 people, have been displaced. And one of the ADB reports also project that on average, 96,000 people could be displaced in any given year in the future by earthquake and riverine floods. So climate change and low levels of human development have increased the risk of disaster displacement. The third fact that I want to present here is the estimates of Nepali workers in India that varies from 2.5 to 5 million. And most of them are from Western Nepal and Taran. And many of them are seasonal migrant workers. So the reason I'm presenting this fact is that there is a high volume of migration happening. It is, and the fourth important fact that I want to present here is the increasing urban population in Nepal. So that means could be a domestic or cross-border international. The migration is happening, and it is rapidly happening. So I think based on that data, we could say that there is a nexus between migration and climate change. And I've identified, these 5 important areas, how, to understand the nexus between, migration and the climate change. The first one is, in the past, when labor migration was happening from Nepal, initially it was considered as a conflict-induced migration. And then as, other factors such as the poverty, underdevelopment, and the lack of livelihood opportunities, in particular, in rural and remote parts of Nepal, were also considered other additional factors. This narrative is true to most extent. However, this cannot be considered as absolute reason when Nepal is slowly and steadily experiencing the impact of climate change and extreme weather events. The second fact, which is very much related to this climate change and migration nexus, is agriculture. As we know that, these sectors provide nearly, 65%, employment in the country. And also, agricultural activities from mountain and Tarai belt is becoming a hard-hit sector due to climate change and extreme weather events. Such events forcing thousands of people, including their family members, to migrate from their ancestral land. Rapid growth of unskilled labor force, in major urban centers of Nepal, as well as an increasing trend of cross-border and international migration is happening due to climate change and extreme weather events in the most recent years. The third, trend that we have observed is that there is also a growing trend of unplanned labor migration due to adverse impact of climate change and extreme weather events. Often, such unplanned migration has been an uninformed labor migration, resulting into workers' exploitation as they are desperate to get into work in the new place. They have often lost their bargaining power to obtain reasonable wages and other social security benefits. In most cases, their labor rights are compromised. The fourth trend that I want to highlight here is, although there is no proper study conducted regarding the length of stay of all categories of migrant workers, our observations suggest that climate change and extreme weather events have contributed to increase the length of stay of labor migrants in workplace destination, burden to repay loans, recovering the financial loss, and other climate crises, and even to cover the cost of family expenses are found some core reasons behind longer stay in workplace destination. And the fifth and and another important trend that we have observed is that uncertain income and productivity due to climate change and extreme weather events have discouraged people to continue agriculture as a core profession. Thus, there is a rapid shift of labor force from agriculture to non-agriculture sector. In particular, foreign labor migration has been an ultimate and easy escape for many Nepalese youth to secure their livelihood. So who are the most impacted group? I should say that these agricultural-based workers and their family members, youth, women, and indigenous people are the most impacted group. And when it comes to the human rights abuses, I think the human rights issues of climate, let's say refugee or climate migrants are not the same, are not the different than the human rights issues of other labor migrants that we have seen, in general. So I think, the human rights issues of climate, migrants should not be dealt separately. I think it has to be part of the human rights framework, the global human rights framework, the regional human rights framework, and the national human rights framework. I think that has to be, one of the important elements. At the same time, the social safety net programs and initiatives that is designed, that is nationally designed for all, also should be, priority, should be a priority concern for, climate migrants. That's what I want to say.
Great, thank you very much, Prakash. I think you further underlined, the trends that Gertrude was speaking to previously, but it's also very helpful to get a better sense of what the situation is going to look like, and indeed what it currently looks like in Nepal as well. I mean, hearing you speak just now made me also... Sorry, this chair is very wobbly. I thought it was just me, but I'm pretty sure it's the chair. But hearing you speak just now just made me think of a conversation I recently had. And it's not in the South Asian context, but more in the Latin American context, where an indigenous family was saying that they feel like they have to migrate, or that their young have to migrate because there are no livelihood opportunities anymore, because the soil is degraded, and it's too hot and there are no other options available. And so for them at least, that creates broader questions and creates broader challenges in terms of them losing their cultural identity as well, because all the youth, or so it seems, are now moving away from these rural areas and are moving more towards urban areas. So there seems to be a cascading effect there, and it's clear that these trends that you are all speaking to aren't also confined to just South Asia. So this is a very long-winded way of me trying to get to the question I had for you, Dino, which is, what currently exists at the global or the regional level in order to help mitigate or prevent the heightened precarity and vulnerabilities faced by workers, but also other stakeholder groups when it comes to migration in the context of climate change.
Thank you. Can you hear me? Yes. Okay. No, I think I agree with the previous speakers and also with your summary just now. I think we can observe that climate change can add to other drivers of migration, right? And the consequences of climate change may add or inform the decision to migrate. But at the same time, of course, these climate variables interact with other drivers. A number of them have been mentioned already, also by you just now. Lack of employment opportunities, decent work deficits, lack of social protection, but of course also demographic developments, as we've heard earlier today, or governance issues. And I think that's also one of the reasons, as you said, why it is sometimes not so easy to really quantify those trends, right? Because the reasons for those movements are sort of like numerous, And in addition, they happen gradually, except for, let's say, when it comes to really sudden onset disasters. At the same time, I think what we can say is that unplanned and unsafe migration that happens because of climate change does present a number of challenges, both to migrant workers and their rights, but again, also to the environment. If those movements are taking place into areas that are already congested, for example, they might be ill-prepared to take on the climate migrants, and that then again can lead to additional challenges related to climate change. I think what we can say and can observe is that there is a need for regular migration pathways. Creating opportunities for decent work at home or sort of like in areas of origin, and I think we've heard that this morning as well in other sessions, can make sure that migration is not a necessity but a choice. But of course that might not be possible everywhere. And where people have to or do take the decision to go on the move, it might indeed be an adaptation strategy for individuals, for their families, or for entire communities. Regular migration pathways for those who are on the move due to climate change impacts can make it possible to ensure that their rights are being protected. And in this regard, such pathways can and perhaps should be considered in national climate change adaptation and planning, but can also be considered in regional or national dialogues. Labor mobility schemes can be a way to ensure that migrant workers or migrants first and then migrant workers are in a position to meet their basic needs. But it can also help businesses if these movements take labor shortages into consideration from a perspective of matching labor supply and demand. And such movements can also contribute to the economic productivities of their destination areas, of course, if planned and managed well. In summary, just to say that I think orderly and well-managed, well-governed migration movements can help to mitigate some of the impacts and perhaps serve as a climate resilience strategy. And with that also have positive development outcomes. Let me leave it at that for now. Thank you.
That's great. Thanks very much for that, Dino. I mean, everything that you've said until now really spotlights how this kind of climate, labor, security nexus, the set of issues that this nexus presents, they come back to business and human rights, right? So you mentioned previously about how people might be compelled into engaging in dangerous or risky work, how they become more vulnerable to exploitation if they're not provided with other employment opportunities as a result of their forced migration. So I wonder, and this is a question to all of you, if we were to contemplate the current trajectory of the business and human rights agenda, do you think we're doing enough? Or what more can we do to take into account all of these emerging dynamics, to pay more attention to this nexus, and alongside it, the other vulnerabilities and the other trends that we're witnessing in this region? I think I might go over to you, Tala. Would you like to comment or share your thoughts on that question? You're on mute, by the way. Oh, sorry. We can hear you now.
Okay. Well, I just want to sort of echo what has been said by most of the panelists before. I think it'd be important to look at it from the national economic lens, I believe. I mean, if you look at the data, most of the people that will be impacted due to climate change are in the lower income demographics, whether in a specific country or overall globally as well, if you look at the graph that I showed before. What that means, the question for me is that the people who are actually migrating, what rung of ladder are they in? Because if I'm losing highly skilled people to this whole migration trend, then I'm actually losing the talent that will help me build the resilience that I need in my economy to create more livelihoods.
But this can only be an adaptation strategy if migration is well managed, well governed, if this, ensures a legal pathway to decent work. So unfortunately, this is not the case. And I agree with you as well. These are not issues that are, specific to only people affected by climate change. These are issues we've been discussing this morning about, labor migration overall, ethical and fair recruitment. But it's definitely sure that people affected by climate change might even be more vulnerable to unethical recruitment, exploitation, etc. So what can we do to ensure that these people actually have access to regular legal migration pathways? I think also probably we will have to be a bit more proactive with that, because what's happening now is that people are somehow making use of existing pathways. We do not have specific pathways for people who are, climate migrants, let us call it like that. So is there a way we can plan for this kind of mobility? If we know that certain communities, will be affected by climate change, by disasters, or let's give the example of the Pacific, which is very obvious, where we know certain islands will literally disappear. These people will have to go somewhere. How can we plan for that? And there has been a lot of discussion with countries like Australia and New Zealand, which are traditional countries of destination for labor migration from the Pacific, but these pathways are not necessarily adapted. They often also don't lead to, opportunities for permanent residence, for citizenship, even family reunification. So can we plan other pathways to give people a choice if we know they will be affected by climate change and they might need to move? One last point I wanted to make is also how we can strengthen our reflection on how the just transition will be affecting migrant workers. Because as we move to the green economy, we know there are many sectors that will be affected: extractive industry, agriculture to a certain extent, and others. And these are often sectors where we see a high prevalence of migrant workers. So let's make sure we don't leave the migrants behind in the just transition, as they might be losing their jobs. And how can we jointly work on, for example, skills development for migrant workers to make sure that they can be employed in other jobs that can support the green transition? I leave it to that. Thank you.
Of course, no, great. And what you were saying just now also very much resonates with the session we just had on just transition as well. I mean, how do we create those pathways? But I mean, to what extent do governments actually recognize the existence of these climate migrants and climate refugees in other instances? Prakash, sorry. What are your thoughts on this?
One point that I missed earlier, I think one of the most vulnerable group that has been impacted by climate migration is children, because the family who are impacted by climate change, they are forced to displace to another location, new locations, and they have to restart their life from the scratch. And in that case, like, not only family member will get into job or get into work, but also, they encourage other family members, including the children at family, they send them to work. So in that sense, that the issue of child labor, might be increased. Though, our observation, our field-based work has not, yet found, but like, there are some cases where, there are like some, few cases like where, children, let's say from Tarai part of Nepal, they are migrating to India, and where they work as a child labor. The similar case, like when the father from the western Nepal migrate to India, they also, take their children, to India and where they work. So I think we should consider this child labor issue when we talked about this climate migrants, climate migration. So that's one of my points. And if we look at this, our development work, that is happening over the past, let's say, 2 decades, particularly in Nepal, where we don't see these private sectors doing it responsibly. One of the factors, why landslides are happening, why flood is happening, I think it's because of our, unplanned development work. It's very much profit-driven kind of development work, and until and unless we address that problem, and until and unless our business community is aware, or sensitized on that matter, then I think we cannot solve this problem. So I think where business community has to be responsible and where the human rights of the people needs to be respected. And definitely, there is an ongoing debate in Nepal and elsewhere that migration governance needs to be strengthened. It has to be, restructured and everything. But I think in the discourse of, let's say restructuring migration, I have rarely heard that, this climate change issue has to be incorporated. So one of my proposal would be like, in the future discussion on issues around, migration governance, I think, this climate change issue should also be there, and it has to be incorporated, in that discussion. So that's, and like, definitely, there's, like since Nepal has this 3-tier of government, there's federal, provincial, and the local level government. So this kind of intergovernmental coordination, is very, very important. And it's not just about coordination, but also this transparency, and accountability is more required to implement the robust climate change financing at the grassroots level. Participation of women at the mainstream level is foremost important, while lived experience of indigenous and marginalized group in climate change and migration discourse could be better pathway to integrate migration governance as broader climate action. So I think, those who are most impacted has to be part of the discussion, It has to be a very inclusive process, So I think that would be the one way to address this problem in the near future. Thank you.
Thank you very much for really spotlighting that need to focus on those who are impacted and ensure that they are at the center of discussions moving forward. Dino, I mean, you touched on some of these issues already in your earlier response to the question of, what currently exists and what more can be done. But I suppose your perspective on the current DHR agenda, do you feel like we're, in one sense, are we even taking into due consideration, like enough consideration, this broader question of climate change and its impacts? I mean, what more should we be talking about? What are some of the research areas, if you helped to identify some already, what more should we be focusing on and looking at?
Thank you again. So yeah, the question, are we doing enough? I guess that's a difficult one. Maybe you just mentioned one area that I agree with, which is to ensure that in the area of migration or labor migration policies, that the question of climate change, the impact of climate change is being addressed and considered. And I'm not sure if that is being done enough at this moment or has been done sufficiently in the recent past. But at the same time, I think it goes in the other direction as well, right? How do we ensure that those conversations or the conversation that we are having today is not just taking place in the context of migration, but also in the context of climate change? In other words, like how to ensure that migration is also part of national climate change planning, adaptation strategies. And I guess that is something that probably can be promoted further. And in that regard also, how to make sure that migration and climate change and the nexus is being discussed under the UN FCCC framework. And maybe if we think ahead a little bit to later this year, will that nexus also come up in the COP28 negotiations, not just as in the margins, but really as part of the actual program? And I guess that is definitely something where the different stakeholders can come together, where a forum like this is probably also a good opportunity to discuss how we can ensure that the relevant fora, that the relevant stakeholder bring this issue up, and that it's not just the migration community speaking about that, but that we really establish those links to the discussions and processes on climate change and climate change adaptation more broadly. And I think, as you said, that this is also then something that could help us with the overall just transition, as was discussed earlier. Thank you.
He was talking about forced and voluntary migration, forced being when there is a natural disaster, and voluntary being when there is
for instance, a long and prolonged drought, people choosing to migrate. I think we're losing one other type of migration in between. So I've seen from my work that when we are implementing climate change mitigation measures, for instance, like establishment of protected areas to protect the already existing forest or like afforestation programs, people are displaced from those reasons. And these people, when they're displaced, they lose their livelihood. Even if the government gives them some form of resettlement programs, they lose their livelihood and they migrate to other places in search of work. So I think one thing that we need to keep in mind is this kind of migration that's happening because we are trying to mitigate climate change. So they may not be directly result from the climate change itself, but I think they should be taken. Thank you.
So can I give you 30 seconds each to quickly respond to those queries?
I don't have anything to respond because I'm not so familiar with all these different processes. So,
I can just say that I fully agree with the lady in the orange sweater that it's always a wide spectrum. That's not something as saying this was fully forced and this is fully voluntary, and a lot of that is mixed, So yes, agree, and thank you for making the point.
Thank you. Just to add, I guess your point also speaks to the broader questions that these different stakeholders need to come together, that we need to break down some of the silos, right? These are questions that all link, and we need to find ways to address them as one, to sort of let's promote that perspective of policy coherence, that we are not sort of like addressing all these issues separately, but we are looking at them as, let's say, in the connected way that they present themselves. And to your question, I can also only agree, those programs, the responses need to be as well thought out as any other program to ensure that we are not creating a problem by sort of like addressing another one. And as I said earlier, if people who are on the move, sorry, I'm stopping immediately, going to areas that are already affected by maybe climate change or other challenges such as demographic developments, then we might not really be solving something, right? We're just shifting a problem. So I also agree with your point here. Thank you so much.
Can you throw to Talha? Tell them Talha to
yes, please come in. Talha.
Nothing else to add, guys. You covered everything. Great job.
Thank you for that, Talha. Can I just point out, Kevin, that we had to start a bit late as well, so, in terms of equity.
I'm sorry, but we have Annie who will be moderating our next session on environmental human rights defenders. Yeah.
So very good, so we can continue the discussion. Our fantastic panel. I know, it looked like I was going to say something else as well. And also thank you to the lady in red for keeping the door closed. I saw what you were doing there. But anyway, thank you so much, everyone. Thank you to our speakers. Let's continue this discussion in the next session.